What if one of the first genocides of the 20th century happened before the world had even created the word genocide? What if an empire tested methods of racial domination, mass killing and concentration camps, forced labor and human experimentation in Africa decades before Europe was forced to confront the full horror of genocide on its own soil? What if people were driven into the desert, denied water, imprisoned, starved, worked to death, and then almost erased from global memory? This is the story of Herero and Nama Genocide. It happened in German Southwest Africa, the territory known as today's Namibia. Between 1904 and 1908, German colonial forces carried out a campaign of extermination against the Herero and Nama people. Historians commonly identify it as the first genocide of the 20th century. About 75% of the Herero population and about 50% of the Nama population died during the German campaign, making it one of the most devastating genocides in modern history. And yet, for many years, the world barely remembered it. It was not taught widely. It was not commemorated globally. It did not occupy the center of international memory. It remained for many a hidden wound in the history of colonialism. A genocide before the Holocaust. A genocide committed by Imperial Germany in Africa. A genocide whose victims had names, families, cattle, land, tradition, leaders, songs, graves, and feature. A genocide that was not accidental. Not simply war, not simply famine, not simply colonial conflict, but a campaign shaped by a racial ideology, land theft, military violence, and the desire to break African resistance permanently. The phrase "forgotten first Holocaust" must be used carefully. It does not mean the Herero and Nama genocide was identical to the later Nazi Holocaust against the Jewish of Europe. The context, method, scale, ideology, and historical moments were different. But the phrase points to something important. It reminds us that the 20th century's history of genocide did not begin in Europe. It began in part in colonial Africa, began where empire believed African lives could be destroyed without consequence. It began where land was more valued than people, began where racial arrogance became policy. It began in Namibia. This is a story of Herero and Nama Genocide, the forgotten first Holocaust. Before German rule, there was a land of people. Before German soldiers marched through the land, before colonial maps renamed territory, before concentration camps scarred the coast, there were people. The Herero were largely pastoralists. Cattle were central to life, wealth, identity, marriage, ritual, and survival. Cattle were not simply economic property, they were social memory. They connected families, they represented status. They were part of the relationship between people, ancestors, land, and future generations. The Nama, many of whom were Kohi speaking communities, had their own political traditions, leadership structure, mobility pattern, and relationships to land and livestock. They were not empty lands. They were not wilderness waiting for European use. They were lived landscapes, places of grazing, places of burial, places of water, places of memory, places of conflict and negotiation. Places where people knew how to survive in a difficult environment. Namibia's landscape is beautiful, but it's also demanding. Water matters, grazing matters, movement matters, seasonal knowledge matters. To live there requires deep understanding of land, cattle, drought, and distance. This is why colonial disposition was so devastating. When colonizers took land, they were not only taking soil, they were taking water. They were taking cattle roads. They were taking burial places. They were taking economic survival. They were taking the structure of life. German Southwest Africa became a German colony in 1884, part of the late 19th century European scramble for African territory. Records show that German protection was declared over these areas on April 24, 1884, and German occupation later expanded inland. But German control did not arrive as peaceful administration. It arrived through treaties, pressure, settler expansion, land seizure, military force, and racial hierarchy. The Herero and Nama were expected to submit. Their land was targeted, their cattle were coveted, their labor was demanded, their sovereignty was denied. And when people resist being reduced to servants on their own land, empire often calls that resistance rebellion. But from the perspective of the colonized, it is not rebellion, it is survival. The colony of racial power. German Southwest Africa was not created to respect African society. It was created to serve German colonial ambition. German settlers wanted land, companies wanted resources, officials wanted authority, missionaries wanted influence. The empire wanted prestige. The land was reorganized through colonial logic. European settlers claimed ownership. African communities were pushed into dependency. Colonial law favored Germans. Debt, contracts, tax, and violence became tools of control. Cattle loss and land alienation weakened Herero independence. Settler abuse deepened resentment. German authorities increasingly treated African autonomy as a problem to be solved. This was not simply about individual cruelty, it was structural. Colonialism created a racial border in which Germans placed themselves above Africans politically, legally, economically, and socially. The colonized were expected to obey. The settlers were protected. The African was disciplined. The settler's property was sacred. The African's land was negotiable. The settler's fear became policy. The African's suffering became invisible. This is the foundation of the genocide. Genocide does not begin only when killing begins. It begins when one group's humanity is downgraded. It begins when land becomes more valuable than the people living on it. It begins when violence becomes normal. It begins when a state teaches itself that some lives can be removed. But the early 20th century, Herero leaders saw clearly that their people were being cornered. Land was shrinking. Cattle was under threat. Settler power was expanding. German officials were increasingly aggressive. The question was no longer whether colonial rule would become oppressive. It already was. The question was whether resistance was still possible. Samuel Herero and the Herero Uprising. In January 1904, the Herero rose against German colonial rule. Their leader was Samuel Herero. He did not act in a vacuum. The uprising came after years of German encroachment, land laws, settler violence, debt, humiliation, and colonial domination. On January 12, 1904, Herero fighters attacked German farms, settlements, and colonial infrastructure. Early in the uprising, the Herero achieved success that shocked German settlers and officials. The German colonial imagination had not expected African resistance to be so forceful. To the Germans, this was rebellion. To the Herero, it was a fight of survival. Samuel Herero reportedly gave instructions that certain groups such as women, children, missionaries, and some non-German should be spared. This detail matters because it complicates the colonial image of African violence. The Herero uprising was violent, but it was not a project of extermination. The German response became something far more extreme. German-centric enforcement. The conflict escalated, and into this war came one of the darkest figures in colonial history. General von Trotha did not come simply to defend an uprising. He came with a worldview shaped by a racial war. To him, negotiation was a weakness. Compromise was unacceptable. African resistance had to be crushed so completely that it could never rise again. This is where colonial war moved towards genocide. A military campaign became an extermination campaign. Conflict over land and sovereignty became a project to destroy people. The turning point of Waterberg. In August 1904, German forces confronted the Herero near Waterberg. The Battle of Waterberg became the turning point. The Herero were not only warriors gathered for battle, Many families, cattle, women, children, and elderly people were also in the area. This was not a battlefield separated from civilian life. It was people under military pressure. German forces attacked and pushed the Herero eastward, but what followed was not simply defeat, it was entrapment. The Herero were driven towards the Omeke Desert, part of the western Kalahari. German forces blocked access to water sources and escape routes. In a dry land, water is life. To deny water is to weaponize the environment. To drive people into the desert is to turn geography into execution. Many Herero died from thirst, hunger, exhaustion, exposure, and violence. Accounts of the genocide reportedly emphasize the desert as a killing field after Waterberg. Imagine the horror without needing graphic detail. Families walking under a punishing sun. Cattle dying, children crying for water, people searching for wells and finding them blocked or guarded. The desert did not kill alone. The desert was used. That distinction matters. Drought is natural. Genocide is political. The Omaheke became deadly because German military policy made survival nearly impossible. Waterberg was therefore not only a battle, it was opening of mass deaths, the extermination order. On October 2, 1904, General Lothar von Trotha issued what became known as the Extermination Order. It declared that the Herero were no longer German subjects and had to leave the land. Herero men found inside German territory were to be killed. Women and children were also to be driven away. In practice, the order condemned an entire people to death through violence, expulsion, and denial of water and refuge. This order is one reason historians identify the event as genocide. It showed intent, not merely to defeat fighters, not merely to arrest leaders, not merely to punish resistance, but to remove the Herero as people from the colonial order. Some scholars note that the German campaign against the Herero and Nama was tantamount to genocide and that enormous proportions of host populations died. The extermination order matters because genocide is not only measured by bodies, it is also measured by intention, by language, by policy, by the logic of destruction. Von Trotha's order made clear that German colonial power no longer saw the Herero as a people with whom political life was possible. They were to be expelled, destroyed, or reduced to total submission. Later, under pressure, the order was formally withdrawn, but by then, immense damage had already been done. And even after the withdrawal, German policy did not become humane. It shifted from open extermination in the desert to imprisonment, forced labor, and concentration camps. The method changed. The dehumanization remained. The Nama resistance. The Herero were not the only people targeted. The Nama also resisted German rule. Nama leaders, including Hendrik Witbooi and Jacob Marengo, became central figures in the anti-colonial struggle. The Nama resistance developed with different tactics, often relying on mobility, local knowledge, and guerrilla-style warfare. The Nama knew the land. They knew how to move. They knew how to strike and withdraw. They knew that the smaller forces could survive against a larger military power through strategy and terrain. But German colonial forces responded with increasing brutality. In April 1905, von Trotha issued a second extermination order, this time against Nama. Nama war lasted longer, continuing in different forms until 1908. Their resistance showed that German rule was not accepted passively. The colonized fought back, they negotiated, they retreated, they reorganized, they survived where they could, but the costs were devastating. Many Nama were killed, others were imprisoned, communities were broken, land was lost, families were scattered. Like the Herero, the Nama were not simply victims, they were resistors. This distinction is important. Genocide seeks to reduce people to objects of destruction. Memory must restore them as historical actors. The Herero and Nama were not only people who suffered, they were people who resisted empire. Concentration camps in the colony. After the desert killings, German policy increasingly turned towards imprisonment. Surviving Herero and Nama were placed in concentration camps. The term concentration camp did not begin with Nazi Germany. It was used earlier in colonial contexts, including by Spain in Cuba, Britain in South African War, and Germany in Southwest Africa. In Southwest Africa, those camps became places of forced labor, hunger, disease, exhaustion, and deaths. Prisoners were used as laborers, families were separated, people were poorly fed, many were exposed to harsh conditions. Disease spread, deaths became routine. One of the most infamous sites was Shark Island, near Ludres. Shark Island has been remembered as one of the most brutal camps in the genocide. Recent research and reporting continue to examine the site, including unmarked graves and the need for proper memorialization. A 2026 Guardian report describes Shark Island as a former concentration camp where Herero and Nama prisoners were subjected to forced labor, starvation, and systemic abuse between 1905 and 1907. The camps were not accidents of wartime chaos. They were instruments of colonial control. They transformed survivors into a labor force. They turned defeat into exploitation. They made the body of the colonized serve the economy of the colonizer. This is another reason the genocide must be remembered within the history of colonialism. The aim was not only to kill, it was also to seize land, destroy independence, and force survivors into a new racial labor order. The genocide broke people. The colony then tried to use what remained: land, cattle, and the afterlife of genocide. Genocide does not end when killing slows. It continues through what remains changed. After the Herero and Nama genocide, land ownership in Namibia was transformed. Herero and Nama communities lost vast areas of ancestral land. Cattle were seized and destroyed. Survivors were pushed into dependency. German settlers and colonial authorities benefited from the destruction. This is why reparation debates today are not only about memory. They are about land. They are about wealth. They are about inheritance. They are about who still benefits from colonial violence. A family that loses land loses more than property. It loses grazing rights. It loses economic independence. It loses burial places. Loses the foundation of future wealth. It loses the ability to pass security to children. The genocide therefore created a long-term inequality. It did not only kill people in the early 20th century, it reshaped the economic future of their descendants. Modern debates about land in Namibia cannot be separated from this history. Recent reporting on Shark Island and related memory struggles notes that descendants continue to demand proper commemoration, reparation, and recognition of ancestral land claims. This is why some Herero and Nama descendants reject symbolic apologies without direct reparation. They argue that Germany's responsibility cannot be reduced to regret. If land was taken, if labor was exploited, if people were destroyed, then justice must be material as well as verbal. Memory without repair can feel like another form of silence. Human remains and racial signs. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Herero and Nama genocide was what happened to the bodies of the dead. Human remains were taken from Namibia and sent to Germany and other institutions for racial signs. Skulls and bones were used in studies that claimed to prove European racial superiority. This was not science in the moral sense. It was racism dressed in laboratory clothing. It was the violation of the dead to justify the domination of the living. The remains of Herero and Nama victims became objects in the museum and universities. Descendants have spent years demanding their return. Germany returned some human remains to Namibia in 2011 and 2018, but many descendants and activists argue that the process has been incomplete and insufficient. The International Center for Transnational Justice notes that Germany returned skulls and other human remains to Namibia in 2011 and 2018, while affected communities continued calling for direct negotiation and fuller reparation. This part of the story is especially painful because it shows how genocide continued after death. The body was not allowed to rest. The ancestors was turned into evidence for racist ideology. The grave was interrupted. The family was denied mourning. The community was denied closure. Reparation is therefore not symbolic only. It is sacred. It is about returning ancestors to the land. It is about restoring dignity. It is about saying that the dead were not specimens. They were people. Why was it forgotten? Why did the world forget? Why is Herero and Nama genocide not known as widely as other 20th century atrocities? The answer lies partly in colonial power. Empires often controlled the archives. They controlled official reports. They controlled education. They controlled what became world history. African suffering was minimized. Colonial violence was renamed as pacification. Mass killing was described as rebellion suppression. Land theft was described as settlement. Forced labor was described as development. Resistance was described as savagery. This language mattered. It made atrocities easier to hide. It made victims easier to blame. It made perpetrators easier to excuse. There is another reason. The genocide happened in Africa. For much of modern history, African deaths were not treated with the same moral urgency as European deaths. The world's memory was unequal. Some suffering was universalized, other suffering was localized, minimized, or ignored. This does not mean one tragedy should compete with another. The point is not to reduce the importance of Holocaust against the Jewish, Roma, or disabled people, and another under Nazi rule. The point is to expand memory, to recognize that colonial genocide also belongs to world history, to understand that Europe's later crimes did not emerge from nowhere. Some ideas, methods, and racial logics had earlier colonial histories. The Herero and Nama genocide should not be remembered only as a prelude to the Holocaust. It deserves recognition in its own right, but it also forces us to confront the continuity of racial violence across empire. The colony was not outside modern history. The colony was one of the places where modern violence was practiced. Germans' recognition and the dispute over reparation. For decades, Herero and Nama descendants demanded recognition, apology, and reparations. Germany was slow to respond fully. In 2015, Germany acknowledged that the atrocities constituted genocide. In 2021, Germany formally recognized the genocide and agreed to provide 1.1 billion euros for development projects in Namibia over 30 years. However, Germany framed the money as a gesture of reconciliation, not legally binding reparation. This distinction mattered. For Germany, the agreement was a diplomatic step. For many affected communities, it was not enough. Many Herero and Nama leaders criticized the agreement because they felt excluded from direct negotiations. They argued that the money should not be treated as general development aid. They wanted direct reparations, land justice, and full participation of descendant communities. The debate continues. In 2025, Namibia marked its first Genocide Remembrance Day on May 28. The German government noted that Namibia had proclaimed May 28 as Genocide Remembrance Day, commemorating the 1908 order to close the concentration camps in German Southwest Africa. Remembrance is important, but remembrance without justice remains incomplete. A ceremony can honor the dead, an apology can acknowledge the wrongdoing, payment can support development, but if descendants still feel excluded, if ancestral land remains unresolved, if remains are still not fully returned, if perpetrators' institutions retain benefits, then reconciliation remains unfinished. The Herero and Nama genocide is not only history, it is a present political question. What does justice mean after genocide? Who has the right to negotiate? Can a state apologize without directly repairing affected communities? Can development aid replace reparation? Who speaks for the dead? This question remains open. The word genocide was coined later during the Second World War by Raphael Lemkin, but the Herero and Nama genocide happened before the word exists. This is important. A crime can exist before humanity finds the language to name it. The Herero and Nama did not need a word genocide to know their world was being destroyed. They saw the desert deaths. They saw the camps. They saw the land taken. They saw the cattle gone. They saw the families broken. They saw ancestors violated. They knew. Later, historians and international institutions applied the concept of genocide to death events. The United Nations Whitaker Report of 1985 classified the massacres of Herero and Nama as an attempt to exterminate those people, identifying it as one of the earliest genocides of the 20th century. The word matters because naming is power. If it is called war, the state can claim military necessity. If it is called a tragedy, responsibility becomes vague. If it is called famine, violence disappears. If it's called genocide, intent becomes visible. The Herero and Nama genocide must be named clearly, not to create hatred, not to trap descendants in victimhood, not to compete with other suffering, but to tell the truth, because truth is the beginning of justice. Memory in the land. The land remembers. The Omaheke remembers. Waterberg remembers. Shark Island remembers. Old graves remember. Cultural routes remember. Families also remember. Even when history books were silent, memory did not disappear. It lived in oral histories. It lived in mourning practices. It lived in names. It lived in ceremonies and in the political demands of descendants. It lived in the refusal to let the dead be forgotten. For Herero and Nama communities, genocide is not a distant event. It is family history. It is land history. It is economic and spiritual history. A young person may ask why their families has less land. The answer may begin in 1904. A community may ask why ancestral remains are in European institutions. The answer may begin in colonial racial sciences. A descendant may ask why an apology feels incomplete. The answer may lie in the difference between words and repair. This is why memorialization matters. A memorial is not only stone, it is public refusal to forget. It says, this happened. It says, these people live it. It says, this land has wounds. It says, the dead are not silent. And it also says, the future must know. The danger of calling it forgotten. We often call the Herero and Nama genocide forgotten. But forgotten by whom? Not by the descendants, not by the communities who carried the memory, not by the families who lost land, not by those who demanded the return of remains, not by those who gathered every year to remember. When we say forgotten, we usually mean forgotten by the world, forgotten by global education, forgotten by European public memory, forgotten by international media, forgotten by people who learned colonial history from the colonizer's perspective. But the victims' descendants did not forget. They were ignored. The distinction matters. Forgetting sounds accidental. Ignoring is political. The Herero and Nama genocide was not missing from memory because it lacked importance. It was pushed to the margins because colonial crimes were often treated as lesser crimes. The task today is not to discover the genocide as if descendants were awaiting for outsiders to notice. The task is to listen to those who remember all along. Lessons from the Herero and Nama genocide. What lessons does genocide teach? The first lesson is that colonialism was not only exploitation, it could become extermination. Second lesson is that land theft can be paths to mass violence. When people's land, cattle, water, and political independence are attacked, their entire world becomes vulnerable. The third lesson is that racism can turn ordinary administration into machinery of death. Once a colonial state sees people as obstacles rather than human beings, violence becomes easier to justify. Another lesson is that genocide is not always sudden. It can develop through years of dispossession, humiliation, militarization, and dehumanization. The fifth lesson is that the memory is unequal. Some atrocities become central to world history. Others must fight for recognition. We can add another lesson, and that is apology is not the same as repair. Recognition matters, but affected communities continue to demand material justice, direct participation, land restitution, and full return of human remains. The final lesson is that the dead are not truly gone when descendants continue to speak. The Herero and Nama genocide survived in memory because communities refused silence. The first Holocaust the world tried to forget. Between 1904 and 1908, German colonial power tried to destroy the Herero and Nama people. It drove people into the desert, it denied water, it imprisoned survivors, it forced labor, it took land, it stole cattle, it violated the dead, it scattered families, tried to return living nations into colonial subjects without power, land, or memory. But it failed to erase them. The Herero survived, the Nama survived, their descendants remember. Their leaders still speak, their communities still demand justice, their ancestors still call from the land. This genocide was long ignored by much of the world, but it was never truly forgotten by those who inherited its wounds. Today, its history demands recognition, not as a footnote, not as a lesser tragedy, not as a colonial accident, but as one of the defining crimes of the 20th century. The Herero and Nama Genocide reminds us that modern genocide did not begin suddenly. It had colonial roots, it had racial roots, it had economic roots, it had land hunger behind it, and because silence helped bury it for so long, speaking the truth becomes a form of repair, not enough by itself, but necessary. The desert remembers, the grave remembers, the families remember, the stolen remains remember, the land also remembers. And now, history must remember too. The Herero and Nama genocide was not simply an African tragedy. It was a human tragedy. It was a colonial crime. It was a genocide, and the world has no right to forget it again.